Thank you. It is great to be here, great to be back at the New York Academy of Sciences, and to go even more deeply in our exploration of the experiences of awe and wonder, which are very primal, fundamental to our lives, I think, but in many ways still quite mysterious. And we're going to try to unpack what actually happens during these experiences in our conversation this evening. To set the stage for our discussion, I want to quote two scientists who wrote very eloquently about awe and wonder. First, Rachel Carson, who wrote the book A Sense of Wonder. She said, and I'm quoting here, "A child's world is fresh and new and beautiful, full of wonder and excitement. It is our misfortune that for most of us, that clear-eyed vision, that true instinct for what is beautiful and awe-inspiring is dimmed and even lost before we reach adulthood. If I had influence with a good fairy who is supposed to preside over the christening of all children, I should ask that her gift to each child in the world be a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life as an unfailing antidote against the boredom and disenchantment of later years." And here's what Albert Einstein said: "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom the emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed." And he goes on to say, "To know what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms. This knowledge, this feeling is at the center of true religiousness." So I wanted to share these two quotes not because they are gospel, but because they make some very interesting claims. Rachel Carson's point is that getting older is one slow, steady slog towards disenchantment and the loss of wonder. And it raises some disturbing questions about all of us in the room here. But is it true? Do we need a kind of childlike innocence unclouded by adult preconceptions to experience wonder? And Einstein's claim that the mysterious is the source of all art and science is not something everyone agrees with. In fact, I've interviewed a number of prominent scientists who are quite hostile to the very idea of mystery, which they think is an invitation to obfuscation, mumbo-jumbo, trying to sneak religion in through the back door. It turns out that awe and wonder raise a number of really interesting questions about both science and religion, and there is also an emerging science of awe, which is telling us a lot about the experiences that we find most meaningful. So we have a lot to talk about here, and we have a great group of panelists to help us figure it all out, and let me introduce them. Lisa Sideris is professor of religious studies at Indiana University Bloomington. Her areas of research include environmental ethics, the environmental humanities, and the science-religion interface. Her latest book, Consecrating Science, Wonder, Knowledge, and the Natural World, examines how scientific rhetoric and narratives about wonder actually pit science against religion and encourage a devaluation of the natural world. She's currently working on a book up at the intersection of technology, religion, and environmentalism, tentatively titled Religion and World Making. Jennifer Steller teaches psychology at the University of Toronto. Her research examines the impact of pro-social emotions, including awe, compassion, and gratitude, on health and well-being. Her research is aimed at understanding how individuals and social groups thrive. She studies how emotions drive us to help others in need or sacrifice our own goals for the good of the group. And in a related line of research, she investigates morality and how we judge people who have behaved unethically and why arguments about moral issues can be so intractable. Piercarlo Valdesolo teaches psychology at Claremont McKenna College and is the director of the Moral Emotions and Trust Lab. His research studies the mechanisms underlying moral judgment and behavior, asking questions like what drives moral hypocrisy? How does awe influence our belief in God? For whom do we feel compassion and why? He's the co-author of the book Out of Character, Surprising Truths About the Liar, Cheat, Sinner, and Saint Lurking in All of Us, which argues that our character isn't a stable set of traits, but rather a shifting state that's subject to the constant push and pull of hidden mechanisms in our mind. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with just some definitions here to lay the groundwork for this discussion. And Piercarlo, let me start with you. What exactly is awe?
Okay, not an easy one to start with. So, I suppose I'll answer that question and also answer what I think wonder is and what I think related emotions like surprise and curiosity are. So I think of all these emotions as epistemic emotions, as related somehow to the acquisition of knowledge and understanding. And they're all unified by some sort of violation of expectation. You're in the presence of something novel, something that you can't immediately understand, something that defies your everyday experience. So an emotion like surprise can be merely that, just something happens that's unexpected. People jump out from behind your couch because it's your birthday. Wow, I'm surprised. States like wonder and curiosity involve not only a violation of expectation, but the realization that there's a gap in your knowledge. Something happens that's unexpected and you can't immediately make sense of it. You wonder what's going on. You're curious. Awe, I think.
Uh-oh.
Very dramatic.
So surprise.
Awe, I think, involves an extra ingredient. Not only something happens that violates your expectations, not only is there a gap in your knowledge that's made salient, but the expectation-violating event challenges the schemas, the knowledge structures that you have to such an extent that you cannot accommodate or you cannot assimilate this information into those structures. Basically, your mind's blown. Like your normal way of understanding the events that you experience in your life isn't allowing you to comprehend what's in front of you. So that's how I sort of draw distinctions across these different states.
So, Jenny, let me turn to you. Is awe its own emotion? I mean, is this different from the other emotions that are out there that we have?
I would argue that it is. I think that it's true that it has some common elements with surprise and wonder, but it does seem to have its own distinct expression. So for those of you who've ever seen anyone in awe, you get these big eyes, the mouth opens. People typically are looking up at something bigger or grander than them. We know that it's associated with certain expressions, nonverbal expressions. So if you've ever heard someone go, whoa, right? That's a signal that they're experiencing awe. So it has some of these markers that emotion researchers look to, like its own expression, its own thoughts or appraisals that go with it that seem to differentiate it from other emotions. And I know we'll get to this later, but it also seems to be uniquely related to particular outcomes. And that's something that distinguishes it from other states. And just to add to the definition of awe, one thing I think is important that we'll also get to probably later is there is this, I would argue, self-transcendent quality to awe. I think it could be part of wonder as well, maybe a little bit less for surprise, but this idea that it sort of draws you away from focusing on yourself and you're really absorbed in the outward, in whatever you're seeing.
Are you, when you say self-transcendence, are you saying yourself, your sense of ego recedes?
Exactly. So that you transcend beyond that looming figure in all of our minds, the self, and for a moment lose track of that, I think, a little bit, to absorb and focus on something else. So that could be people in your environment, but it could also be just sensory information, a beautiful sight that you're seeing. And I think that quality of awe is really fundamental to the emotion and important to why we care about it so much.
So, Lisa, let me turn to you. I mean, you are not a psychologist like our other panelists here. You actually are a scholar of religion. Do you share those definitions?
I think I see wonder as the umbrella term, so I write more about wonder than I do about awe. And actually, Rachel Carson is one of the people who's my common reference point. So I think of wonder as being kind of the umbrella term, where on one end of the spectrum you have something like awe in that's bordering on fear, or the sort of fear and trembling that one speaks of, kind of reverence that also fades into fear. On the other end is kind of delight, or something that's a sort of pleasure. We do associate wonder with children often because it assumes a kind of pleasurable, delightful state to lose oneself in a completely enjoyable way. And if you look at some of the roots of the word wonder, one etymology traces it in words like miracle and miraculous and admiration to smile. which is interesting, sort of smile on one end of the spectrum. And in some accounts, although it's a little bit more speculative, there's an etymology of wonder, the German Wunder, that traces it to wound. And so that kind of element of awe that can be, that can open you up in a kind of terrifying way and expose you or make you vulnerable, I think is captured in the open wound of wonder that it opens you up, leaves you feeling exposed, perhaps, but then many good things can come from that kind of vulnerability. So I think of it as wonder. Awe might be one part of wonder, and there's a kind of, more pleasant sensation on the other end of the spectrum.
Well, as I was looking at the etymology of these two words, I came across, apparently the word awe comes from Old English, Old Norse language that kind of refers to fear and dread, which, we tend to think of awe and wonder as, oh, aren't these fabulous? Don't we all want experiences of awe and wonder, and yet fear and dread doesn't sound so fabulous.
I look at the baby with their eyes wide open, staring out at the world, and I see some amount of terror. That to me isn't obviously an experience that I want to have right now.
Yeah.
Sometimes it seems towards delight, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think, Jen, your work speaks to this for sure. So why don't you?
Yeah, we had the same idea that you did. We thought, well, when you ask people about awe and they tell you about beautiful sunsets and art and music, but then you see these definitions, and even in the Webster dictionary definition, dread features prominently in there. People have talked about awe as a form of fear. So I don't think that interpretation is too far from the truth. And what we found is that, about 20% of awe experiences do seem to have strong elements of fear.
What would be an example of that?
So we've had participants report on, apropos of being here, on thinking about September 11th and the shock and awe that they felt at trying to think about just the immense misery and tragedy of it all. So there are these experiences like that. People will also talk about seeing a tornado or a lightning storm from the safety of their own home, which is probably what differentiates it from just being terrified, right? If you were outside in a lightning storm, that would be a different emotion. So we get those kind of experiences. But I do also want to say, for the most part, people are reporting these very positive experiences of awe. Now, I do want to add a cautionary note to that I'm not sure that represents the experiences of awe across different cultures. We've done some work that finds that in other cultures that fear element is a bit more prominent. And I wonder to what degree maybe our goals of feeling happy and positive as a culture, as a Western culture, have washed this emotion of its fearful elements a little bit more. And if you go to other cultures, you can see, if you look at the meaning of awe in other cultures, you can see that fear element, that respect element, reverence, as you mentioned, is a bigger part of the emotion. So,
which cultures are you talking about?
Well, we've done work in China. We find that in China, awe experiences typically incorporate more fear. If you look at the definitions across a number of different cultures, in Hindu, you'll see that the elements of fear and respect are more prominent. So I have a feeling as we do more research on awe and the science of awe increases and expands to better incorporate more cultures, we might see a bit of a different side of this emotion than what we found in Western culture.
So this is actually a very new science, right? The study of awe. People didn't really study this 20 years ago, did they?
Not from my knowledge. When I started writing about this topic, maybe you've had the same experiences. I had to reach out into religion, philosophy, art. I had to talk about concepts like the sublime, which comes from aesthetics, because there wasn't really much in psychology and certainly not very much in affective science or emotion.
Yeah, that's my impression too. So one of the seminal papers came out in 2003 by Decker, Keltner, and John Haidt. And then after that paper, there was sort of a couple of affective scientists who followed it up with empirical work. And then I'd say over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a dramatic increase in interest.
But Lisa, certainly people have been talking about awe and wonder for forever, basically.
Yeah.
For millennia. Certainly philosophers and...
and I think in the religious traditions, there's often been a juxtaposition of wonder with curiosity, also the sublime, which I was thinking when you were speaking as well. Philosophers have spoken a lot about the sublime. And wonder and curiosity have at various times in, especially the history, I think, of Christianity, Western thought. Sometimes wonder is the one that's praised, and sometimes curiosity is the one that's praised. So, there have been religious thinkers from early on, people like Augustine, who felt that curiosity was potentially a vice because there's a way in which there's something acquisitive about it, or it's prideful. It's a kind of idle knowledge that you don't really need, that you accumulate because it kind of puffs you up with pride. It's things you don't need to know.
Well, you're also questioning authority.
You're questioning authority, and it detracts you or distracts you from thinking about God and God's creation, whereas wonder could be this kind of reverential feeling towards the Creator, so that curiosity then becomes something that is kind of like scratching an itch, a puzzle-solving impulse that leads you on and on and on in a kind of addictive way, like chain smoking or something. Whereas wonder, ends in God, and so it has a much more wholesome kind of orientation. So those kinds of debates have gone on forever. And of course, people in the humanities have also written about wonder and awe, but not trying to sort of pin it down in terms of how people experience it or what happens in the brain when people experience it, but just kind of thinking about what these terms are and how they lead to other kinds of ethical states and spiritual states.
So I want to zero in on this new psychology of awe. So what are people finding out about what this actually is? What happens when people have these experiences of awe?
Well, I think we really first we dove into what kind of outcomes do you get when you feel awe? What do you find? Then we actually took, I think, a few steps back and tried to figure out, actually, what is this emotion? We don't even know. We have trouble classifying it as positive or negative, right? It defies some of these emotion theories that we have. So the science sort of moved forward, and then backward a little, and now it's moving forward again. But we know, maybe I'll cover some of the more social outcomes. You can cover more of the cognitive outcomes based on our backgrounds. But we know that it promotes humility, which I think is a valued trait in many cultures. It promotes prosociality as part of, I think, that self-transcendent element where you're focusing more outward on others and what other people need. A sense of interconnection, common humanity, interest in things that affect all humans because you feel more connected to other people out there in the world. We still know very little about experiences of awe towards people, which I think is a shame, and we're learning more about that. But there's been arguments put forward that it promotes this sort of strong group orientation and identification with a group. And I think that could be a really fruitful direction for research, both in a potentially good direction, but also maybe a dangerous direction, right? If you think about the antecedents of cults and some of that behavior. Charismatic leaders. So it does seem to be associated with these self-transcendent pro-social outcomes, which is why I typically put it in that category of emotions. But that being said, it has really fascinating cognitive outcomes as well, and it's unclear to what extent these are all intertwined, and some are just in a social realm, some are in a cognitive realm, or to what extent these are simultaneously interesting outcomes happening at the same time. So maybe you can cover some of those cognitive.
Sure. So the research that I've done related to awe looks at its relationship to feelings of uncertainty, inability to explain what you're experiencing, and the motivations to explain and to find meaning that experience can evoke. So, for example, we find that when you have people watch video clips that elicits awe, they report lower tolerance for uncertainty, and this in turn motivates them to report greater belief in supernatural agencies, so belief in God, belief in supernatural forces like karma. And we also find that this effect depends a bit on the theism of our participants. So, for example, if you're a theist, then awe has a direct effect on your strength of belief in the power of supernatural entities. If you're a non-theist, the relationship's a little bit less clear. We have some evidence that suggests for non-theists, it increases your affinity for scientific explanations for the world, but with mixed results. So we get sort of a clear effect for our theists, but our non-theists, we don't quite know what's going on with them yet.
How do you study this? I mean, you both have labs, I presume. Do you get your college students to come in and participate?
Yeah, we have them watch videos of planet Earth, which works pretty well for everyone. We're trying to pilot some new stimuli for people because someone who makes you feel awe might not make someone else feel awe. We know that. I really like taking people out of the lab, though. So I try whenever possible to take people into nature areas. When I was at Berkeley in California, we took people to a place where they could look out over the whole Bay Area. It was a 360-degree view. Now that I'm in Toronto and it's winter, we've had to be a little more creative. So we've been working with the Royal Ontario Museum, and they have some really awe-inspiring exhibits. We will take participants to those, and they're always really excited because they think they're going to sit in the basement of the psychology building and click on the computer for 2 hours, but they're going to the museum. So I do think it's an emotion that's very well suited to getting people out in the field because it's such a big emotion. There's some work on, I haven't done this, but on virtual reality, and they have some really interesting results because that immersive experience, I think, is a really valuable part of awe.
It seems like you would want brain scans here as well. I mean, have people been put into scanners with, fMRI imaging?
I know of a couple of studies that have done that. But at the end of the day, no matter what technique you're using, you will eventually have to make reference to someone's self-report about what they're experiencing. So whether you're taking them out into nature, showing them a video clip, putting them in an fMRI machine to see what areas of the brain are active, you then ask them, well, what are you feeling right now? And if they say awe, then motion researchers say, oh, we're studying awe. So there's definitely some lively discussions and debates just in emotion research in general, but particularly for the study of these kind of new emotions that we don't really have a good sense of the definitions yet. Are we studying what we think we're studying?
Mm-hmm. So I'm so curious about how a religious scholar would approach some of these questions and I'm wondering if it's sort of different than what a psychology of awe would come up with. And I mean, we've talked about Rachel Carson, for instance. I mean, there's a whole literature of naturalists in particular who talk about this and, not necessarily in very scientific terms. And I guess I'm wondering, is it just a different way of describing awe or wonder, or is it actually a different understanding of the experience?
I think it can be a very different way. It kind of depends on the scientist, for example. You said naturalist, which maybe is a different thing than a scientist. But I think scientists speak very differently about wonder. There are some for whom wonder is really wonder at the knowledge itself. Although wonder has often been thought to be the thing that sort of prompts inquiry or is the goad to knowledge. It can also become the sort of reaction to the accumulation of knowledge, especially a kind of theory of everything kind of thing, where there's a huge body of knowledge that's very comprehensive, that explains a lot of things. The thing about wonder in that sense, and I'm using wonder specifically, but maybe it's awe as well, is that then when you're wondering at the sort of, I would say, product of the human mind, not to say that it doesn't match reality in some sense, but the wonder then is sort of directed back to the knower or to the knowledge, rather than something sort of beyond the human. And so whether or not wonder kind of engenders states that we admire, like humility, I would say things like empathy, connectedness, I think depends very much on the objects of wonder. And if the objects of wonder are very tightly bound up with humans and human knowledge and kind of pride in our knowledge, then it may or may not produce something like humility. On the other hand, those kinds of experiences that you're talking about where one feels themselves to be very small in the face of something, or the dissolution of the ego and feeling connected with things around you, that can that can be a very humbling experience, and people can have those experiences in nature. They can have them in cathedrals. I think so. So the way I often think about it then is when we talk about wonder, is wonder at what? We have to sort of identify the objects before we can assume that it's going to produce kind of moral or ethical or spiritual states that we consider desirable.
Well, it seems like there's some pretty big questions here. I mean, is wonder fundamentally an emotional experience? I think that's sort of been the assumption here, or is an intellectual understanding of how the world
so,
works?
I mean, one term that's been used to describe it is that it's a passion of the intellect, so which of course doesn't answer the question. It's somewhere in between an emotion and a cognitive state. But I think what scientists may experience as sort of epistemic wonder or knowledge-based wonder may not be accessible to the average person. So what they're describing as wonder at their own understanding of the universe or something that's very hard to comprehend, Einstein, for example, the rest of us may not have access to that knowledge and thus not to that wonder, whereas we all have access to sensory experiences in nature, for example. So, someone like Rachel Carson, I think, was very interested in cultivating that kind of wonder through the senses, which is something, we can all do in some way. Whereas I can't necessarily understand the physics or, the theories behind the universe, that I can't wonder. I just have to trust the scientist that it's something I should be wondering at, which creates a weird kind of hierarchy that's almost puts scientists in the position of a priest, of revealing, the revelation that's handed down to the rest of us.
And I think it's maybe a mistake to try and separate emotion from cognition. So early emotions that researchers were interested in, joy, sadness, they were simple. They're wonderful emotions. But as we've gotten more interested in these complex emotions, I function in this space, gratitude, compassion. I get questions all the time about whether those are emotions or not. I start to think that, when we encounter something that is extraordinary, otherworldly to some degree, that is a cognitive experience, but it's so overwhelming that, as you said, it becomes emotional. So it doesn't, I think emotions like awe, they have both elements. They're very cognitively complex, but they still feel like emotions. They feel passionate, but intellectual. And so I'd argue that we should be comfortable with the fact that it does fit in between and has both of these elements.
But it does raise the question, does learning about something, does knowledge lead to wonder, or does knowledge actually diminish it? I mean, going back to the quote that I read about from Rachel Carson,
Yeah.
I mean, sort of, that children have the sense of wonder, presumably, because they don't understand a lot of
Right,
stuff.
right.
They don't
So-
really understand how the world works. And so,
Yes.
the more we understand stuff, I mean, her argument is it diminishes the experience.
There's diminishing returns. I think, to associate wonder with ignorance is a problem then, because when knowledge is gained, wonder self-destructs. It's self-eradicating in that way. So it's it's replaced with knowledge. So in that sense, how does science produce wonder? It actually kills wonder, if that's how you think about it. I think if you don't think of wonder as being associated with not knowing so exclusively, or a state of ignorance, then you don't run into this kind of concern that once you sort of, solve the puzzle or something, then the wonder's going to disappear. I think there's a way of thinking about wonder as in one sense, a way of being in the world, which I think is how maybe Carson wanted to think about it, is that it's a way of orienting ourselves in the world that you can sort of cultivate, so...
Can
not at every
you explain
moment.
that? I mean, what does that mean? What is that way of
Well, I
being
think,
in the world?
one way that she thought about it is that what you read, in fact, is that if you can instill it in a child, especially early on, then it becomes this indestructible thing that you have throughout your life. But that doesn't necessarily mean that any of us at any age can't cultivate wonder. But it's a sense that it's not wonder in this sense is not wondering what something is. It's not seeking explanation. It's wondering that something exists at all. It's what people sometimes call sort of ontological wonder. Like, why is there something rather than nothing? So the facts don't explain it away because it's not the explanation, right? The explanation is not the experience. So in that sense, wonder can, I think, abide when it's not so closely connected to either ignorance or explanation.
It's almost some existential state of being is what you're describing.
But
Fascinating.
you can work on it. I mean,
Yeah,
you can sharpen, you can cultivate it, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a way to tightly link wonder with explanation and still not be committed to the view that, say, scientific progress extinguishes wonder. And that is just to say that the answer to every question leads to more questions. And if
This
you
is what
are-
I call serial wonder.
I like that.
I think
serial
it's still a
wonder.
little bit pernicious
Yeah,
because
right.
it's,
And if
it's
you're-
the addictive quality, right?
And if your disposition is to be wonder prone, or in psychology we have a construct called awe-proneness. If it is in your nature to look for those questions even after you've answered the one that you had previously had encountered, then it's just going to be serial wonder and an iterative experience of generating these epistemic emotional states. So I think we can still say that knowledge in some way, and as you were saying, extinguishes wonder relevant to a particular question, but is a stimulant of wonder just because it generates all sorts of new questions.
So the subject of sort of this relationship between awe or wonder and religiosity has come up here, and I've interviewed a lot of scientists, including a lot of atheists, and I've noted and very prominent people, Richard Dawkins, E.O. Wilson, and I haven't interviewed Carl Sagan, but I think he would fall in this camp of atheists who basically have come to use awe and wonder. My reading of it is as a substitute for religion, and I guess the question is that a fair thing to do, or is that kind of, I don't know, are they talking about something different than a more traditional spiritual view of awe or wonder? Lisa, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I've actually written about two of those people, Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson. I have a chapter on each of them in my recent book. So I think that problematically what they're suggesting is not just that wonder, scientific wonder is a kind of alternative religion or spirituality, but that it's a superior one. So what they're saying is, if you think you know wonder, or that you've experienced wonder, you haven't experienced the real thing until you have experienced scientific wonder. And there's a way in which this setting up of science and religion kind of treats religion as if it's a poor attempt to do what science does, as if its function is to explain the world, but it's just doing it badly, which is not really what religion does. So I think there's a tendency to focus, for example, on creation stories, as if religion is trying to explain the world in the same way that science does. Religion does a lot of things other than that. So Dawkins, for example, though he talks a lot about wonder, he's a little bit uncomfortable with this word. So he has a book that he wrote for young people, sort of kids and teenagers, called The Magic of Reality. And so what he's arguing there is that, you may wonder at the sun and the moon and, the seasons, but you really need to direct your wonder at the explanation of those things. And then you're wondering at reality. So there's a kind of policing, I think, of wonder here, to say that unless you've experienced it in the scientific sense, you have not experienced real wonder. So that's more the Dawkins account. I think
So you think he's wrong?
Sorry?
You think he's wrong?
I think he's wrong, yes, because I think in part he doesn't understand what religion is. But also that's not a very interesting account of wonder for the average person, to tell them that the scientists have got hold of the thing and that you need to direct your sense of wonder to those things. Again, in part because the average person is not going to be able to experience that sort of wonder firsthand. And so it puts the scientist in the position of dictating to the rest of us what's real and what we should therefore direct our wonder at. Now, as you know, Dawkins is very uncomfortable with mystery. So he understands science to dispel mystery. So, he goes after the Romantic poets, for example, for dwelling on, the world in a grain of sand. Rather than solving the puzzle, they're interested in dwelling in it and sort of reveling in the unknown. And he thinks that's a kind of despicable thing to do.
So does does Dawkins think that the experience of scientific wonder is distinct from the experience of religious wonder, or is it that he thinks that there's some greater value, moral worth to scientific wonder compared to?
Yes, because both maybe, but I think the scientist keeps working at it. The scientist is not content to gawk. So there's an association there of wonder with just sort of the instead of pursuing the puzzle and solving it, of just saying, let's just dwell in sort of childlike gawking. Whereas the scientist gets to work to solve the problem. And then when the problem is solved, one wonders at the solution, not the thing, the mystery that initially prompted it. That's just not a formulation, I think, of wonder that's very appealing to the average person.
So I'd love to hear from our scientists on the panel. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah. So the idea that awe and wonder are sort of secular versions of religious belief makes me. It confuses me because it's not the way that I think about the relationship between emotions and these different kinds of belief systems. So, in my own work, I think of awe and wonder as disposing individuals towards these different kinds of explanations, right? So the same kind of state, awe or wonder, regardless of the stimulus, can motivate an individual towards theistic or non-theistic explanations for the world. So I don't see the state itself as sort of an alternative to religiosity. I see the state as, depending on the person, pushing us towards these different kinds of explanations.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'm probably not totally realistic, but a more generous take on what these scientists might be arguing is, man, religion has in its corner these really powerful emotions like awe, that make meaning for people, that help them search for meaning or stimulate the search for meaning or just part of that experience. And science can also have that. And so if organized religion doesn't do that for you, science can be a place for that. And as scientists, we're sort of missing out by not really putting that part of the scientific process forward, because there is, to me, a lot of similarity in this idea, at least behind awe, where most of my background is, that, we live in this band of our existence as human beings, and then on occasion, we get to peek up or down or just outside of that band and see something for maybe just a moment that's beyond what we normally encounter. And to me, that feels like it could be a religious experience, but it could also be a scientific experience. And that similarity is more meaningful to me, I think, than the difference. And so I've always thought that science has this really powerful tool of wonder and awe that seem to be something people need and they like and they enjoy. And man, we're not broadcasting that that's part of the experience of science enough. And if we did that, maybe we could get more people on board and into the scientific process. So I think that's more generous than probably Dawkins.
And I should say that, and I don't think that, I'm not suggesting that all scientists think this way. I think that the conversation about wonder has been dominated by, a couple of very kind of popular scientists who dictated this kind of discourse. When you talk to average scientists in the lab or in the field, I think they speak in different terms.
Well, I just want to push this point a little bit, sort of like trying to talk about the spiritual experience of wonder versus maybe the scientific experience. So if, a classic religious story is Paul on the road to Damascus, or Saul. He has this overwhelming conversion experience, which I think we would call an experience of awe there. Mm-hmm. So you have something like that, and then you might have a scientist who discovers something truly amazing that just overturns the conventional thinking, just mind-blowing. Are those fundamentally the same kinds of experiences?
To me, they are, right? So I could imagine, instead of Saul, Carl walking down the street, and the clouds part, and there's some massive flash of light, and he feels awe. But instead of looking for a supernatural explanation for this event, he looks for scientific explanations for what just happened. So the nature of the emotional experience is the same, regardless of whether it's Carl or Saul or Paul. but the consequences are different depending on what kinds of explanations they gravitate towards.
Lisa, what do you think?
I think it gets very complicated because of how we use these terms, religion and science and spiritual. It's certainly the case that people like Richard Dawkins or E.O. Wilson are experiencing something that I would call religious. And actually, Wilson is much more open to that. Dawkins really chafes at the idea that, that the way that he speaks about science or wonder really is religion.
Explain why are you saying that their experiences are actually religious?
Because they feel they're in the realm of something of ultimate significance, of something sacred, something that is an object of reverence. Those are features of religion. So there are all kinds of religious affects and rituals and things like this that occur in the seemingly secular world. So I think that kind of separation of the secular and the sacred, or the secular and the religious, doesn't actually hold in most of how the world operates and how people operate.
So we need to, part of the problem is we don't actually understand these words like religion. We have a lot of us have a misconception of what religion is.
Well, and I think scientists, Einstein, preeminent scientists, saw art and religion and science as branches of the same tree. And I'd argue at the root of them is awe and wonder, and that emotion that stimulates discovery and spiritual contemplation and artistic expression. So, I think many scientists would see the similarities there, and I think that that you're right, that there's some very strong voices with particular opinions, but there are perhaps more similarities than differences.
Now, we've been talking about a lot of the kind of mind-blowing, almost once-in-a-lifetime experiences, particularly of awe. It's also a more everyday kind of thing, right? I mean, we can go through life and just there can be a moment of, wow, really? Have you studied that kind of thing?
I've done what I call daily diary studies, where we have participants report each night on events that happen to them. And part of the reason we did this with awe is because we didn't know how frequent it was, and whether people would say, yeah, I went the whole 2 weeks and I didn't feel any awe. And it turns out that about twice a week is what we were finding, that people were experiencing this emotion. And you're right, it wasn't, this transformative, once in a lifetime experience, few times a lifetime experience. It was things that you would think are more common.
Like what?
So I always love the things that people wrote about. So we had a lot of students, so they were taking classes. So they would take an astronomy class and learn that the universe is expanding. We had a lot of people who talked about just walking home and seeing the colors of a sunset, and it stopped them in their tracks and really made them focus on that for just a moment. Everything else quieted. We were running it at a very particular time, and Master Chef, I think it's Master Chef, was happening, and there was a blind chef, and a number of our participants reported that they felt awe towards this woman. So, it's really amazing. And one of the other things I did, which I'm glad I went back, I looked at someone who had reported feeling awe very frequently. And you mentioned the awe-prone person. I'm like, what did this person experience? How can they have something like almost every day? And my favorite experience they wrote about was that, and this probably happens to many of us, they make their coffee and they pour the cream in, and they stop and they watch as the cream swirls in the coffee and makes this really beautiful pattern, which I hadn't watched or looked at until this person wrote about this experience. And they felt awe just at the beauty of it. And I thought, man, like we could all be more like that person and have these daily little booster shots of awe from our coffee. So I do think that as scientists, we have to figure out what kind of awe we're talking about. And there are these really revelatory types of awe, but there are also these everyday experiences. I get them when I see the fall leaves change color on my walk home in Toronto, and there's maple trees everywhere, and they're orange and green, and it looks like they're on fire, right? So I think we all have these experiences, and in fact, I'd argue these are maybe more meaningful for us because they're more common. And we seek them out, right? We go to the symphony, we go to art shows and museums, we travel, we get out in nature, we find these experiences, even if we don't really know that's what we're going for. I think that's part of it.
Can we cultivate this? Obviously we can go to music and we can go to art museums, look at great art, go walk in the woods, but is there a way of actually cultivating our openness to have these kinds of experiences?
Yeah. So for me, it requires a greater tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, an openness to the idea that you are ill-equipped to explain your surroundings, and that is naturally an aversive state. It's anxiety-provoking to look out at the world and feel like you can't explain it, and to think that it's perhaps more chaotic and less ordered than it actually is. So I think just sort of normalizing that belief about the world is a way to make yourself more operant.
So admitting the mystery, I guess, is what we would say, right? I mean, you didn't use that word, but
right.
I would.
Yeah. So to the extent that mystery there implies it's just something you can't explain, some amount of uncertainty and ambiguity in what you're experiencing, then yeah.
But that's also fascinating because, some people are very uncomfortable
Right.
with uncertainty, right? With ambiguity. They want to know how things work.
Right. And that's why you get some types, of scientists, for example, who want to have the kind of unified account, the regularity, the consistency of the universe, the law-like nature of the universe. And that is the thing they find wondrous, whereas others, I'm personally, find that very confining. I'm much more the ambiguity and the chaos or the contingency, I think, is what makes things really awesome. And yeah, so just as a background condition of the world that we live in.
Yeah, so I'll just mention one particular finding that I think is very relevant to that. In one of our studies, we found that for our non-theists, the key to making them gravitate towards scientific explanations for the world when they were experiencing awe was to frame scientific theories as providing order. As opposed to emphasizing randomness. So we gave them different versions of evolutionary theory. Mm-hmm. The actual Darwinian version, which is very much about randomness and uncertainty, right? And then one that described evolution as ordered, as directed, as leading towards something. And it was only when we gave the non-secular folks this ordered version that their feeling of awe and wonder dispose them towards believing even more.
So some of this seems to be kind of just temperamental, the way that people, different personality types, in the same way that some people are, that experience of kind of, the dissolution of the ego might be terrifying to some people, and other people would welcome it and want to have it again and again. So
we've been talking about these experiences very much from an individual's perspective. As you described, self-transcendence, but I'm wondering if there is an ethics to awe or wonder as well. Does it make the world better? Does it make us better people if we have these experiences?
Depends on the object.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Depends on the object of awe.
I think when I think of some of the most important social revolutions that we've been through, right? As a world, like the fight for civil rights, right? That there was an awe to that movement. There was a feeling of unity towards something greater than the self that transcended each individual, that brought everybody together to move this larger mission forward. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. But for that, you also have, as we mentioned before, these dangerous situations where people have cults of personality, and that cult leader says, you will do this thing for me that might, at an individual level be something that goes against their ethical code. But again, because they feel part of this greater, mission or collective, they're willing to do things they wouldn't otherwise do.
Well, you watch some of the old video reels of Nazi rallies, Hitler up there. That seems like an experience of awe there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I often think of the Jonestown Massacre, where people willingly committed suicide at the behest of their leader, right? Something that just goes against every bone in most people's body, right, to survive. And I think that really suggests that awe can be this powerful tool for cultural transformation, but it can also be dangerous. And it may depend to a large degree on the leader and what that leader is going to use that emotion that they've cultivated for. And, you know, so if you can predict that, you might be able to tell which direction it will go. But like anything, I think it has power for good and evil.
But you were also saying earlier that this seems to contribute to a lot of pro-social behaviors. I mean, for instance, when people have experiences of awe, they seem to be more generous.
We have seen that. I would like more data because a lot of that work is in response to nature, where you look out over this beautiful vista and it creates this connection with other people, and that, you know, is part of this small self, and that promotes this pro-social response. But I would like to see it in some group settings, in some maybe even religious settings, if there's some kind of conflict, intergroup conflict. Because in those settings, I'm not sure you would see the same thing. I could easily imagine a situation where you feel awe in this very strong group setting and you feel part of this collective, and now there's another group that you perceive to be threatening your group. And that all could actually exacerbate the lack of empathy and maybe the aggressive, hostile tendencies you'd have towards another group. So I think these are really hard questions to test, and they're not very well suited to the lab. And I think it's incumbent on us as scientists to grapple with those questions. And what you're seeing is like beta version awe, and we're going to have to keep, as science does, moving forward. And I think later iterations, you'll see some more nuance, is my guess, to this idea that it's always a pro-social emotion, always promoting this morally righteous outcome that we see as desirable.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying that no matter where the future research in psychology takes us, we'll never be able to answer that particular part of the question, right? So we can describe how awe, for example, motivates us to fold into a social collective, to cooperate with others, but to then say, and that's a good thing, and that's a bad thing. Well, that would just be us, you know, putting our philosopher caps on for a second, and then immediately taking it off.
Well, that's what I do in my work. I say there's good kinds and there's bad kinds. I mean, I'm an ethicist, so I make normative claims, and I think that I'm not surprised that people, when their wonder is sort of oriented towards nature, that brings out some of that generosity. Because I wouldn't want to overstate this, but I think wonder needs to have as its sort of ultimate object something beyond the human. So something like nature, or, you know, a kind of spiritual realm. Because I think wonder always exists in society, but it goes underground, or it gets perverted in some way. It will find objects, and, you know, in some sense, we have an abundance of wonder right now in terms of a kind of, you know, techno fascination, a kind of, you know, technophilia that I think is potentially dangerous, because it's not clear what will place limits on the pursuits of, you know, technology and certain kinds of science, things like gene editing. I mean, without having wonder express itself, orient itself towards something that is understood to be inherently valuable, it just becomes that kind of puzzle-solving serial wonder, which just moves from one thing to the next. So
I'm going to ask a very speculative question here. So if one of the primal experiences of awe is yourself recedes, and you kind of have this, feeling of unity with the universe, could we somehow tap that impulse, that powerful emotional experience, to deal with the climate crisis, which is all about trying to get beyond just our own individual situation, or even our own sort of national quandary, and sort of to see things in a more of a global context? Is that just pie in the sky thinking?
Well, I mean, one of the things about climate change, and we were talking about some of this beforehand, climate change is it's so abstract. I mean, it's becoming less so because there are actual events that people are experiencing, you know, that I think we can now say, you know, are, you know, manifestations of climate change. But the global nature of it, the temporal nature of it, that it's lagged through time, that our, you know, future generations are going to experience it much worse than we do. Those aren't the kinds of things that humans are kind of, I think, wired to think about. So one way of kind of experiencing climate change and feeling that connection to everything has been, in some environmental movements, the use of psychedelic drugs to open people up, to actually feel the trauma, to feel the empathy. I mean, one of the really big central values of the Extinction Rebellion movement, for example, is cultivating empathy. And people who have taken these drugs and, their leaders in this movement advise other people to take them, have felt, profound empathy with the suffering of other humans and non-humans, and felt that connection to something that's too abstract and intangible in our day-to-day lives to connect with under normal circumstances, I think.
And these are people in the movement already.
People in the movement, and also kind of advising others who want to be in the movement to, consider this as one way of connecting.
Yeah. So I think it would be interesting to know whether or not you could get the same effects for individuals who might be resistant to the movement. So I think that, given, Jenny, the way that you're talking about perhaps like the in-group boundaries for all experiences, it makes perfect sense to me that someone who takes a psychedelic drug and has the disposition towards this movement already, well, that will just get them to, universally identify and motivate action. But for someone who maybe is not quite as disposed, what would that do? When their self recedes, with what will they cling or identify?
Yeah.
That's less clear to me.
We just have to put it in the water.
I do think there is a as yet untested idea, though, that because, especially in these sort of non-social contexts, nature and art and music, because it seems to promote this collective identification with humanity, might be able to promote more collective interests in things that are beyond an individual or a group. And climate change, to me, feels like a perfect example of that, right? Because we're all on the same planet, we're all in the same boat. And that poses problems. It makes climate change a collective action problem. But emotions like awe and maybe to some degree wonder, if they're able to build that collective identity, I think they would have a better shot than some, alternatives at promoting an interest in these issues that are really, they feel far away and lagged, but do affect all of us.
And I think it's also it is the trauma of it. I mean, you're encouraged to actually experience that trauma rather than to sort of keep pushing it down. I think that gets back to that original idea of wonder and awe as being something that opens you up in a kind of painful way, that there's an open wound of wonder. There's that fear of awe. And, to experience that rather than denying it, then can change you. I mean, at least that's the idea behind it.
So I want to go to our audience and their questions in a few minutes. But before we do that, I'm wondering how this study of awe and wonder has affected each of you personally, if it has. Have you changed anything in what you do, your daily routines or some of the activities you sort of carve out for yourselves? I just sort of want to hear from each of you on that. Jenny?
Sure, I'll start. Well, I originally started doing some of this work looking at awe's impact on health and well-being, which we didn't talk too much about, but long story short, it seems to be uniquely very beneficial. So this emotion, not that other positive emotions aren't wonderful, but this is doing something a little bit different and beneficial for health and well-being. And so for me...
Can I just interrupt for a moment?
Sure.
Because I think we should just spend a little bit of time talking. In what way is it beneficial for our health?
Well, it seems to, at least what we've been finding is it seems to reduce stress. I think it's part of that experience of zooming out and seeing yourself from just this different place where all of your hassles, which felt really big at that moment, feel a little bit smaller. And I think it's when the ego fades away, the ruminative tendencies that you have for that self, you get a little respite from those. So we think that's probably what's going on. We find some benefits. They're correlational. We're trying to do the experiments right now for immune functioning, which was meaningful to me because we're seeing tangible changes in the body. And I think what that led me to feel and enact in my own life is that I see a lot of the activities that I do as somebody who likes to experience awe. I do go to museums, and I like to go to concerts, and I love to travel and be in nature. And I saw those as luxuries that I would do if I had time. But, I have to get my work done first, and maybe I would be too busy. And now I'm like, well, I'm just maintaining my health and well-being. So if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to go take a 15-minute walk on the rooftop garden in the summer and recenter myself, feel a little bit of awe, really pay attention to some of those beautiful flowers, and then come back to work. And so I feel a little bit on a mission to help other people feel that way and to not see it as a luxury, but to build it into your life. And I think health and well-being has felt like a good route for me to do that, because people want to be healthy and they want to have a good life and be happy. So if not just for those, there are all these other benefits to it as well. So that has changed me, I think, and made me maybe feel a little bit better about the things I liked doing and already wanted to do anyway.
I mean, do you feel noticeable difference? I mean, do you feel, I don't know, a greater sense of well-being?
I do feel that break from the stress helps me. I feel for a moment, I think I have a loud internal voice, and it does get quiet for a moment, and I appreciate that silence. And I think it does help me see things differently. We talked a little bit about the cognitive effects, but I think it, for me, maybe makes me a little more creative and think outside the box, because I'm not in this stressed out, narrowly focused space. So I feel like I have, but, I mean, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, so it's too late for me.
Piercarlo?
So it's a hard question. I think it's made me appreciate, or at least respond more positively to, I guess, the absurd theater of everyday life. Like just people doing normal people things that would otherwise frustrate me and confuse me. Now I just respond, or I tend to respond with, what is going on in this person's head? Like more of an approach. I want to understand. I'm confused. Things are uncertain. But man, this is something I want to wrap my head around. So I felt this way the other day when I was sitting in a committee meeting, and notorious for just arousing negative emotions. And the faculty member, without any self-awareness, was just speaking for 20 minutes straight towards the end of the agenda, and then finally came to a close, but then had an additional agenda item to add at the end of the fact. And normally this would drive me bonkers, but I was just like so amazed. Like, what is this person thinking? How could they be so unable to recognize what's going on here? So it's just those little things, those little things that have made the uncertainties and ambiguities and just confusing elements of life a little bit more positively tinged than negatively.
I have to try that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've always been very drawn to the kind of Darwinian account. So it was interesting when you mentioned that, when you give people sort of different accounts of evolution, the ones that are more directional versus kind of more random and contingent. I've always been very comfortable and kind of reveled in that kind of contingent account and the uncertainty of that. But I mean, for me, nature is certainly a big part of, what I do to kind of experience wonder and the change of the seasons and some of the things that you mentioned as well. But I mean, I think in the years that I've been really kind of thinking about wonder in an intensive way are also the years that, since I had a child and who's now 13 years old. And I think that's one of the amazing things is to see, first of all, just the process of pregnancy and childbirth, which is something we know about factually in great detail. There's no mystery to it. And yet just the thing itself is so extraordinary. And then seeing a person change year after year, especially when they become a teenager. And that's a whole new world. So, those things these are not rare experiences. They're experiences that many or most people have. But it's just the fact of how they are at all that is so incredible. So.
I mean, it's so interesting hearing what all of you are saying. I mean, you're really it's a different mindset. I mean, what we ordinarily might see as a negative experience, sitting in that incredibly boring faculty committee meeting, or dealing with a teenager who's acting out and somehow turning that around and thinking, oh, wow, this is kind of remarkable in some way. I don't know.
Yeah.
If we all can. Okay, so let's go to you. I'm hoping that this has raised some questions for you. There are 2 roving mics here, so I'm going to call on you, but you have to wait until there is a mic. So.
Well, some people talk about it as almost this like passive receptivity, where you're just absorbed in whatever it is that you're seeing, and part of that sort of quieting of the ego and that self-transcendent is that you just sort of take it all in, and maybe that I think is what you're getting at. So I do think there are certainly times, we don't even know what proportion those are, but that awe might actually promote this sort of stopping.
Yeah.
And just taking it all in and trying to figure out what's happening, which like maybe some people talked about it as it's both approach because you're like, I want to understand this thing, but avoidance because you're like, I don't understand this thing. And that ambivalent motivation can just lead you to not do anything as you're trying to sort it all out. So I do think that's an important point you're bringing up, that feels like an important part of the awe experience. And it does seem that studying awe across a longer period of time would be useful. So I think in that moment, that might be what you see, that pausing and receptivity. And then over time, it might lead to some action, like, let me figure that out and understand that more and take action, or maybe it leads you to just wonder at the next thing. And then part of it, I think, is making meaning from it, which we didn't really talk too much about, but that also, I think, has to happen later, because in the moment, you may not be making meaning then, because it's just overwhelming.
We should actually spend a couple of minutes talking about making meaning. You're saying that these experiences can help us make meaning?
I think they can. I think they at least help us try. I think they motivate us to try. As you mentioned before, we have these schemas of how we think about the world, and now we've just seen something that flies in the face of that. And to me, how can that not make you take a moment to make meaning out of it? And you might even find meaning in the fact that it doesn't fit, right? And that might be part of the religious experience or the scientifically religious experience that you just don't understand. We don't understand infinity. It's hard to comprehend it. We might not have the mental capacity to do that. We don't understand what God is, and we might not have the mental capacity to do that. And so I do think that what we don't know a lot about, but it will be an important part of awe, is how over the long term this emotion translates into trying to make meaning. And then whether you're successful or not, that might lead to different consequences.
And you're saying it induces that urge to make meaning because it sort of, it throws some of our preconceptions out the window.
It's challenging.
Some stuff sort of didn't make sense, and it kind of gives us a new, perspective on the world?
Yeah, that's my impression as well. And the perspective on the world that you end up with might not be necessarily the truth of the world. It might be the most salient explanation, the easiest explanation, the one that makes sense in the moment. So I agree completely with Jenny that it engenders this motivation to explain and to understand and to find order and meaning. But the direction that motivation takes you could vary. And it's not always going to be towards true sources of meaning or scientific truths about the world.
Who wants to weigh in on psychedelic experiences?
Well, I haven't had any, so I can't speak firsthand. There have been, I think there have been people in the past. I keep thinking of people like William James, who wrote a lot about, the kind of personality type that makes one inclined to be religious or to have a kind of conversion experience, and even, tried things out on himself, and to try to think about, the importance of that kind of openness that can be engendered by those experiences. Why it's coming back into vogue now, I'm not really sure. I know there are things like Michael Pollan's book, but was there something in the culture at large that people? Maybe it is this meaning making. That there's this has come back around as something that's...
Well, I think one thing that has happened is a lot of the scientists who are now studying it have reclaimed some of the early research from the 50s and 60s that, especially in some of the more therapeutic uses of psychedelics, possibly being helpful in treating depression or anxiety or addiction, and they're realizing, oh, actually, there seemed to be something there, and that, of course, it was all banned and went underground, and then finally there has been approval for some of these clinical trials, and so it's starting to come back, but it's still early
And in
stages.
part maybe because there is such widespread depression and anxiety in our society.
I find the idea of using psychedelics and the science behind it to inform my research on awe very useful. So I think that the transformative nature of some of those psychedelics feels very similar to awe to me, and I'm not sure that it's not the same thing. So when I write about awe, I often will reference that literature. And I think there are some similar areas that are worth exploring. So you mentioned some of them, depression. We talked about this self-transcendent quality of awe and a quieting of the ego. I've been begging a clinical psychologist to do a study with depression and awe to try and see if it's uniquely beneficial at quieting that ruminating, loud ego, which isn't telling you very good things about yourself. And I've been using some of the work on psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca to sort of back up these claims that I'm making about awe, because I think they are relevant. When we look at some of the neuroscience, which we didn't have a lot of time to talk about as well, there's some indicators that this unselving or this loss of self that happens during these psychedelic experiences change the brain in reliably interesting and useful ways. And I think awe could be nice to see if awe might have similar patterns. If people are experiencing awe, they wouldn't probably show it to the same degree. These awe experiences are probably a little bit our everyday awe experiences are probably a little bit less intense than psychedelic experiences, but I would love to know if those patterns are similar. And I think some of the early research is indicating they might be. So I think your intuition about informing our science of awe with the use of psychedelics to me, seems right on.
I definitely agree that it can be useful. So this is something that I'm very actively interested in my research. This is in collaboration with a friend of mine whose name is Andrew Stallman at Occidental College, and his area of expertise is early science learning, so social cognitive development. How do you get early learners to replace their naive intuitive theories about the world with more accurate scientific theories about the world? And so our project is geared towards trying to create, pedagogical interventions or structuring curricula such that we can trigger awe experiences in these early learners and get them to go through the process of what's called conceptual change. So replacing their naive theories about, say, physics with more accurate scientific theory.
Can you give an example of that? This sounds fascinating.
Sure. So, and this is mostly rooted in just fantastic work by Andrew Stallman. He's got a book called Science Blind, in which he describes all this. It's an excellent book. It came out a couple of years ago. For example, children have an intuitive theory about buoyancy. Heavy things sink, light things float. Well, what sinks and floats is about mass. And you can violate children's expectations about what will sink and float by, say, instead of dropping something in regular water, tap water, dropping it in salt water. So you drop an egg in salt water and it floats. And this is a way to violate their intuitive physical theory about the world. And our prediction is that these kinds of violations are going to be the kinds that trigger awe and motivate explanation seeking from these early learners. So this is some work that we're doing in some science museums in the Pasadena area, where we get 4 to 6 year olds. We show them these kinds of violations of their intuitive theories. We measure the degree to which they report experiencing awe-like states, and then we measure the degree to which they're interested in learning more about the scientific domain, the degree to which they gravitate towards attractions in the museum that are related to the underlying principles. So, yeah, that's all.
I'm not sure. That sounds to me like kind of teaching children not to trust their own kind of sensory, intuitive experiences of the world. I mean, and to replace that with the explanations, to me, sounds like it undoes wonder in some way.
So the undoes wonder, I'm not sure that I would say it undoes wonder, but it is definitely rooted in the belief that their intuitive theories are scientifically wrong. And that if
aren't they kind of sciencey though? They're just, I mean, they're completely scientifically wrong.
So there's a particular class of intuitive theories that are scientifically wrong. So, for example, another one would be intuitions about thermodynamics. A child believes that if you wrap an ice cube in a scarf, it will melt faster than an ice cube on the table, right? So it's because it's nice and cozy. Mm-hmm. So they have these kinds of intuitive theories that are, according to Professor Stallman's research, partly innate, partly learned from their experiences, that are sort of clear violations. Now, he doesn't want to say that all their intuitive theories of the world are wrong. Certainly not. But if you can identify the class that are wrong and then find systematic ways to violate them, then that's going to trigger their feelings of awe and wonder, and it's going to motivate them to learn more about that particular domain.
I mean, for me personally, it does feel very similar, even though it's not science. It's challenging my expectations about the world. So when I look at a piece of art, I mean, sometimes it's just infused with so much beauty that I feel awe for the beauty, but often for me, it's the challenging art, or the music that, crescendos in this amazing way in which all of these unique instruments come together in this moment. And it catches me off guard, and it, again, defies my expectations. And I think that element of it feels actually very similar to more of a religious type of awe or a more science-based type of awe. And so one of the things that I often think is, we talked a lot about science and religion, but I think I see awe as a really important feature of art as well. And in fact, to me, that's what unites art and science and religion all together. It's people trying to reach out to the world, to something beyond what they can normally see and understand, and see something else. And I think art is a beautiful example of that. It's just people choose different mediums. And so whatever the medium is for a particular person, it still feels like it's rooted in a similar experience.
I think fiction as well is really... For me, I mean, fiction, partly because when you're reading someone when you're in like the hands of a great writer, it's so hard to understand how a person does that, and you know it when you see it, but you can't teach people really how to do it. And even, and I don't write fiction or anything, but even in my own writing, I find that I don't really know what I wanted to say until I start writing, and then it takes on a sort of life of its own. And I think there's something that happens to many of us in kind of, day-to-day experiences where we find ourselves doing something creatively that we can't explain or replicate when we want to.
And I mean, I have that experience a lot. I mean, and I think I especially have it going to art museums of that, how did they do that? Mm-hmm. Sort of trying to figure out where that creative impulse, especially someone who helps open up my eyes. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think a really great artist can reveal something about human nature that maybe I'm thinking mostly visual art, but I think, musicians as well, of course. So something about human nature that is universal in all of us. And once in a while when we feel that similarity and that connection, there's something awe-inspiring about that, about when you strip down humans and we are, we feel very different, but we're actually all quite similar underneath. And I feel that way too, right? So there's awe at like how they did it and what they're trying to convey, but even just in the subject matter, and trying to fit that into what I know about the world, can elicit awe, I think.
I haven't noted it in my work, but it reminds me of the quote, "I contain multitudes." Like this idea that you, in realizing your connection to the universe around you, you expand. You realize that that there are multiple parts, perhaps multiple selves that reside within you that can be expressed in different contexts. I mean, I don't know of any work that has even thought about the expansion of self as potentially related to our experiences. But I mean, I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I haven't seen that either. I think it's a really cool idea. I'm not sure it would be what you would find, because I so robustly find in my work that there's a sense of small self, that you do sort of, I think you feel interconnected with everything in the world in some way, but you're a small part of a larger design or a grander design. So I think you are part of it, but at the same time you realize you're a very small part of it, which is maybe where the humility components I've found come from. So I think that, it would be interesting to see some sort of self-expansion in the sense of feeling bigger. I think what you might find is self-expansion in the sense of connection to other people and feeling like you're in this web of interconnectivity. And if anyone can think of a way to measure it, please tell me, because I've tried to think of ways to measure how connected do you feel with other people, and that phrase is the only way I've thought to measure it. So that's pretty much.
Are you talking about self-expansion or sort of elevation of the self? That a kind of like aggrandizement of the self. Do you mean that, or more like the expand? Because I think those are different things. And I mean, I can think of cases where, in science writing, the kinds of people I'm referring back to, the popularizers of science, where you can tell the whole story of the universe in a way that ends up being about how important humans are. Because for one thing, we have the minds that figured it all out, and the whole cosmos is leading towards this complexly conscious being that's us. So if you want to, tell that story, you can still tell it in a way that's very much about stroking the human ego.
We should leave it there. Leave it kind of with a question, which is a perfect place to leave it for this topic. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, and thanks to you.